Okay, thank you, Will. Thanks for the introduction. Jen, do you want to kick off?
Hi everyone, yeah, I'm Jen Fish, as the slide says. I'm currently a consultant at PA Consulting, specialised in asset management, principally within utilities and in defence. And as Will said, I've worked with John for the last, I don't know, too long, 5 years maybe, to deliver a very similar session at the IAM's annual conference. So we've hopefully tried to translate that into a good set of slides today and a good webinar piece of material. So enjoy, and as Will said at the beginning, if you've got any questions, drop us a line afterwards if we can't answer it today.
Okay, and I'm John Green. I work for Anglian Water, title Strategic Value Manager. I've been there for almost 15 years in a number of different roles in asset management, currently responsible for our investment decision-making processes. Previously led Anglian Water to being one of the first companies in the world to achieve ISO 55001 certification. For those of you who are unfamiliar with that, that's the international standard in asset management. And I used to be chair of NxtGen until Will has kind of taken over and leading that now. So quite a bit of IAM experience as well. So that's me. And as Jen said, enjoy.
So yeah, again, welcome. As the title suggests, this will be a brief introduction to the subject of asset management. We'll be starting right back at the super core fundamentals. I'll be using the IAM's conceptual model as the structure for the webinar. Don't worry if you don't know what that is yet. We'll look at each element in it in detail, and we'll try to bring it to life a little bit so that hopefully you can relate to it as an individual, if not as a business. We'll then cap the session, as Will said, with a bit more detail about the IAM and NxtGen, how you can get involved, and then hopefully we'll finish up with the questions that you might have posted in. So yeah, as Will said, drop any questions in the chat, and then we'll look to answer them, hopefully, in the end, if they're not too tricky. Fab. So as I said, right back to basics. What is asset management? It's fundamental that we're all talking the same language when it comes to asset management. So what is it? The first thing, if you Google it, the first thing that comes up is usually JP Morgan or UBS or BlackRock. And what they're talking about there is financial asset management. What we are talking about today is physical infrastructure asset management. So when we read the definition, it's asset management is the coordinated activity of an organisation to realise value from its assets and achieve the organisation business objectives. Not wildly catchy, but that is from ISO 55000. As John kind of said a second ago, ISO 55000 is the industry international standard for asset management out there. Just picking a couple of key words from that definition, in my opinion, the really important ones there are coordinated and value. We'll look at the word value a bit later. I think John will cover that. But coordinated is a super important word here. It is, a whole organisation endeavour asset management, and to be successful requires a really joined up approach across the board. It needs to be the whole organisation pointing in the same direction, operating in a consistent, logical manner. Again, the key word is coordinated, so to be consistent is great. I guess the only other thing to say about ISO 55000, so John mentioned before that Anglian achieved ISO 55000 certification, and that's great. The ISO, like all ISOs, provides a really good framework for operating, but it isn't the be all and end all. I would really advise against businesses purely chasing certification. As I said, the ISO is a framework for operating and not necessarily just one for catching the certification.
Absolutely. Okay. I have to bear with us with the technology a bit. It's a bit slow on the clicks. So we had an explanation from Jen there about what is asset management, but what is an asset? So if we think about the organisations that we work within, can you think of some assets in your organisation? Maybe if you work in rail, you might think of the track. If you work in water, you might think of the pipes and so on. The definition, also from ISO 55000, is an item, thing, or entity that has the potential or actual value to an organisation. I think we might have copied and pasted that quote wrong. It has the potential to add value to an organisation. The interesting words here are item, thing, or entity. So when we think about physical asset management, we usually think about something that you can touch or you can pick up, you know, like a mug, for example. But an asset doesn't have to be a physical thing. It could be data. It could be an intellectual asset. One of the best examples I've heard of this, NATS, the National Aerospace Agency, they class the airspace as their asset, as having the airspace available has the potential to add value to their organisation. So when we're thinking about the assets of our organisation, it might not just be the kind of big physical things that we're broadly familiar with. So sort of have a think about that and see if you can now think of some new assets for your organisation.
It's probably worth also saying that, you know, not all of us in this webinar will work for asset owners or operators. I know some people are probably contractors and consultants in this call, but even as individuals, we are asset owners, which we'll go into in a bit more detail, hopefully to bring this to life later.
That's right. We're all asset managers in one way or another, sort of whether we're doing that consciously or not. So think about an asset hierarchy here. If we've got a sort of asset at the bottom of this hierarchy, I'll just use a simple example. If we think about a boiler, maybe the boiler in our house, that's an asset. But that asset on its own doesn't necessarily deliver much. It might just sort of sit there. You have to connect it with other assets. So you might have to connect it to some pipes, to a gas supply, to some radiators. And when you connect those assets together, it starts to provide some form of a service. So you've now got a sort of central heating system, which is an asset system. And when you put that together with other systems and create this asset portfolio, then you end up with the sort of a house somewhere to live. The service is somewhere comfortable and warm to live, and that's provided through a number of asset systems which are made up of a number of assets, and it all links together. So when we think about an asset, we could be talking about it at quite a macro level. You know, a house is the asset. But we could also be talking about it at a sort of component level, which could be the boiler. And we need to think about asset management in the context of those different levels.
So I guess that plays back to, you know, everyone speaking the same language, because unless we all speak the same language, if we're trying to do asset management properly in an organisation, there's absolutely no way we can do it in a coordinated manner, as I said before, unless we all understand what we're referring to when we're talking about each of these elements.
I think another point to pull out here is this bit about providing a service. So we have assets for a reason. They perform a function that ultimately provides some kind of service or benefit, which kind of links to value. So when we talked about the definition of an asset, we said it's an item, thing, or entity that has the potential to add value to an organisation. What do we really mean by the word value? I'm sure we've probably all got sort of our own interpretations of it. In the context of asset management, I just wanted to pull out a few key points around the word value. So it's very much dependent on the organisation. Value to one organisation might look very different to another, and that depends on really what the strategic objectives of that organisation are and who their stakeholders are. So one organisation value might look like a great dividend that's returned to shareholders, whereas for maybe a charitable organisation, that's perhaps not value. Maybe that would look better in terms of reinvestment in projects or whatever that might be. So in the kind of scope of your own organisation, value will mean different things. Second point, the right balance between cost, performance and risk. And we're going to talk quite a lot more about cost, performance and risk, this sort of holy trinity of asset management. Well, the point I really wanted to get across there is that sometimes when we think about value, we think about reducing cost, or we think about maximizing performance, you know, getting the best thing we can. In the context of asset management, it's about finding the right balance of cost, risk and performance. And for different organizations, that's going to look very different. If you're an organization that is at the absolute peak of performance and cost isn't an issue, then, you know, maybe value looks like those incremental increases in performance. Whereas you might be an organization that's really cash tight, and you need to make sure that every pound you spend goes as far as possible, in which case sort of cost might become a little bit more important. So you have to find the right balance between all of those. Whole life considerations. So when we think about value, we're not just thinking about value today. We need to think about it over the whole life of an investment or an asset or a service. So lots of organizations might think, well, I can save some money today, but does that give you a headache later on? Does it increase your operational costs? Great example of this is, you know, when you buy a car, the tire size, the wheel size that you choose on a car, you're locking in future spend on tire replacement and so on. So really thinking about the value that you're delivering throughout the life of that asset. And then finally, as I sort of touched on the previous slide, is the value is driven through the service the asset provides. And joining up those assets is where we get real value. So buying a boiler on its own, it's great. I've got a boiler. I can probably sell that boiler again and it's got some value to me. But if I join it up with all the other elements of that central heating system, it delivers value in a very different way other than just sitting there and having resale value. It delivers value in terms of warmth and comfort and so on. So when we think about the value an asset provides to our organization, think about it in the context of its function and the service it provides. So
I think that is hopefully the fundamentals and kind of terminology that we use throughout this webinar. So hopefully we're now all on the same page with that. So flipping on to the benefits of asset management. I know asset management can seem like a really time-consuming approach, and it sounds from the outset quite complicated, and can be if you make it complicated. So I said it can be a time-consuming approach and a series of activities for an organisation, and for some organisations, particularly those who are really immature at asset management, obviously that requires a fundamental shift in how they do business and what they focus on. However, taking an asset management approach to your organisation really has a raft of benefits. I know the IAM aren't paying me to say this. I genuinely think it's true. You know, as the slide shows, benefits are both kind of immediate bottom line affecting, so directly cash related, but also asset management provides kind of less tangible benefits. You know, for instance, on the slide, increased reputation and increased social responsibility. So picking a couple of those, for example, immediate bottom line benefits are quite simply driven by a more effective approach to investment in the asset life cycle. It's that simple. But then obviously you get things like sustainability, which we all know is a hot topic, no pun intended, at the moment. And asset management provides a mechanism for considering sustainability throughout all your asset decisions. It provides kind of the framework for that consideration and lets you evidence it throughout the whole piece. And then, if you're a regulated business, for instance, which I know a lot of large asset owning organisations are, asset management approach gives you a more structured, consistent approach to investment decision making, which should let you evidence to your regulator the reason you're making the decisions you are, giving you greater credibility with the regulator and hopefully things like better settlements. Similarly, if you've got customers or parent companies and they can see a clear logical approach to managing your assets, and obviously your reputation with them increases all round and can only be favourable. So I guess what, as I said, I'm not being paid by the IAM to say this, but I think, it genuinely has across the board benefits to everyone, both internally in your business and externally in the supply chain and all that. So that is the basic building blocks of the definition. So now it's time to explain what we really mean when we talk about this asset management approach. So far, John and I have briefly talked about it, and this conceptual model is a diagram that the IAM uses to pictorially reference what asset management is within an organisation. First off, you will notice that there are a lot of elements, and it does seem complicated, but throughout this webinar we're going to have a go at explaining it all to you. First off, I'll answer the title of the webinar, I think, that we had on the website, where do I start? The answer is anywhere, which isn't particularly helpful. Hopefully there is no start point, no finish point, there's no pass go, you can't collect £200. It's continual. The job is never done. You will never complete asset management, even if you get the shiny ISO 55000 certificate. You're not done, sadly. But on a lighter, more positive note, the model is applicable to any industry, any asset owner, operator. But as John said earlier, because we're presenting to so many of you from different backgrounds at the moment, you'll for today have to interpret for your particular organisation. as I mentioned before, even if you don't come from an asset owning organisation, we're all asset owners and asset managers, even if you like it or not. A lot of you will own cars and houses and bikes, and there's decisions to be made about all these things, and you kind of do it subconsciously at the moment, but it's definitely a more structured way of thinking about it. So this webinar will look at each of those boxes in turn. We'll talk through a bit of theory, so I'll play the bad cop and do that, and then hopefully we'll bring it a bit more to life using a transport or car example. So John will play good cop there and play the more interesting part. I guess the only other thing to say before we dive into some of the theory is that if you want to know more information about any of this stuff, the Institute of Asset Management has a really good, fairly succinct manual, I guess you could call it, called The Anatomy, and it's available on their website, and it goes into a bit more detail about each of these subjects, but it's not hugely thick. It's a fairly good read, one for your spare time. So yeah, so if you want more information, that's the place to go. So let's begin. As I said, there is no beginning and no end, so naturally I'll start in the middle. This may not be the obvious place to start, but life cycle delivery tends to be what most people assume asset management is. However, there is plenty more to asset management than simply managing your assets. Most organisations that claim to do asset management, most of them just do this little circle here. They buy something, they use it, they do some stuff to it, and they get rid of it. But what we want to talk about today is that there are a lot of inputs and outputs to doing that a lot more effectively. And by not looking at those inputs and outputs, you are not making the most of your asset base and not driving the most value from it. So we'll look at this in a bit more detail. So as I said, lifecycle delivery is what most people assume asset management is all about. And although it isn't everything, it is, as I said, a fundamental block of the model. So we're looking at a bit more detail. There are 4 obvious stages of an asset lifecycle: acquire, operate, maintain, and dispose. However, there are decision points at each stage of that lifecycle. For instance, in the acquire stage, you've got options. Do you buy something? Do you lease it? Do you buy it new? Do you buy it secondhand? When do you buy it? You've got options when it comes to maintaining it. You can either perform regular maintenance on whatever it is you're considering. You can maintain it until it fails. You can maintain it once it reaches a certain performance threshold. You've got options and decisions. And dispose stage, for instance, you've got options again. Do you demolish it? Do you upcycle it? Decisions. And the key to asset management is how you make those decisions more effectively, balancing off cost, performance, and risk. And so, as John said, we will harp on about cost, performance, and risk a lot in this presentation, but if you take away nothing else, it is using that to make these decisions a lot more effective. So that's my first bad cop bit. I'll leave John now to give you a bit of food for thought in terms of reality.
Right. Wow. So this slide looks remarkably similar to the last one, doesn't it? So sort of my job here is to translate this into an example, and we're going to talk about a car and transport. I just wanted to really highlight a point that Jen made, which is managing assets is sort of one element of what we're talking about, and this life cycle is typically what we might think of when we think about managing assets. Asset management is that broader picture, and hopefully that will make a bit of sense to you by the time we've finished. Just thinking about, what does life cycle delivery mean in terms of a car? So if we just sort of take the acquire stage, you got some decisions to make about how you procure that car. Do you buy a new one, second-hand one? Maybe you're going to lease one. Maybe you're going to borrow one, or maybe it's parents' car, or maybe you're the parents, sort of lending the car to someone else. So how do you procure? How do you acquire that asset? Once you got that asset, how are you going to operate it? So how are you going to drive that car? If it's a company car, are you going to drive it differently to if it was your own car? I'm not suggesting that any of us on the call would do that, but maybe that would play into your decision. Are you going to drive it in a way that conserves fuel, or are you going to sort of drive it in a way that perhaps doesn't, which maybe comes back to what you're going to use it for. When we maintain it, there's lots of decisions to be made. Do we get the service done as soon as it sort of flashes up, or do we wait a bit to do the service? Do we run our tyres to failure? You know, all of us listening to this have probably got slightly different approaches to how we maintain that car. If you paid, you know, 100 quid for the car here, maybe, you know, as soon as it needs new tyres, you're going to dispose of it. Whereas if you paid £10,000 for the car, you're probably going to replace the tyres before you buy a new one. And I'd kind of hinted there on disposal. And this is an area of the asset life cycle that's probably kind of under discussed. So sort of what do you do with that asset at the end of its life? Do you resell it? Do you scrap it? How do you realize value from the disposal part of the life cycle, as well as realizing value from sort of using the asset for its intended purpose? An example I often use here is when your mobile phone contract is up for renewal and you're going, well, do I get the latest fancy phone, or do I get, I don't know, maybe last year's model, which is a bit cheaper? How many of you factor in the resale value in 2 years' time when it's the next time to upgrade the phone? And that's sort of what we're talking about in asset disposal here. So what you do in this disposal section can actually influence what you do in the acquire section. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense in terms of a car. I'm going to hand back to Jen to talk about organizational objectives.
Yeah, as I said before, the life cycle deliveries all sounds very logical, very sensible. It's all probably very obvious, but the nuances in asset management is about how you make those decisions smarter, more accurately, and ultimately just better. So we've got we'll consider the next elements of the conceptual model, and hopefully we will try and show you the bits that kind of feed into that life cycle and how we can make those smarter decisions. So starting now from the top, the logical. This box sits on the fringes of the model. Every organisation will have top-level business objectives and internal and external influences on how it operates as a business. Some of these will be maybe directly asset related. It may have specific goals, but some of them are likely to be just broad strategic business goals. But it is, you know, it's key to have a full appreciation of these so that ultimately you know what service your assets need to deliver, you know, to successfully deliver those business objectives. Specifically understanding your organizational objectives and strategic plan, you know, ultimately influences what asset strategy you build. As I mentioned, there are both internal and external drivers for your organizational strategic objectives. There are things that you cannot control, such as legislation, political landscape, global economy, you know, things that will affect the way your business operates and the things it wants to achieve. You know, and then there's internal factors. You know, your own company will decide, you know, the strategic direction for your assets. So, you know, your parent company may have specific ideas about what it wants to achieve and its shareholders, etc. I guess an important point to note here is that particularly the external factors, many of them will change over time, and we'll talk about this a bit later. But, you know, particularly if we think about the current economic climate, for instance, you know, businesses will obviously change their operating and their objectives to suit. I mean, I'm not sure about you, but I've personally changed the way I work, and I'm sure a lot of businesses have as well. And this in turn obviously affects the way in which you want to manage your assets and the objectives you want to achieve. As I said previously, there is no end to asset management, so it's really important to keep monitoring all of these factors. I mean, that's good business practice anyway, but if we have an asset service hound, it's particularly important to you know, manage these and monitor these aspects with relation to your asset service and your asset strategy. Because obviously, ultimately, you know, you still want to make sure that even if these things change, your asset strategy is fit for purpose.
Just to add there as well, I think, you know, we all work in an extremely sort of challenging and volatile environment, especially at the moment. And asset management is a great framework that can help us to respond to those external factors in a way that's good for our organisation. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about what this means in the context of our car example. So thinking about these external factors, and we can sort of break them into 4 areas. So customers, what do your customers want? What legislation exists? Investors or owners, and commercial environment. So let's kind of think about this in terms of a car or some transport. Who are your customers? Who's in your family? I'm just going to disclose I didn't put this slide together I'm just going to put that out there. Jen's laughing. In terms of legislation, what are the kind of legal requirements that are at play here? You know, you might need a driving license. There's speed limits that you need to adhere to. Maybe you live in London and there's a congestion charge. What about diesel engines? What's going on with those? So all sorts of changing legislation. You know, if the speed limit was scrapped, for example, maybe that would change the decisions that you make about your assets. If you needed to take a super duper difficult driving test, maybe you might look again at whether a car's the right solution for you. Commercial environment, really important here. How are you funding the not just the purchase of this asset, but the maintenance of this asset? So are we talking about some of this is covered in the commercial environment, in this commercial environment here. In fact, I'm not sure they point at the right thing, but anyway. So is it a loan that you're taking out to pay for this car? Are you paying it through a monthly salary? What if your employment changes and maybe the, I don't know, £600 a month that you're paying for the car is no longer feasible? So lots and lots of external factors that influence your sort of your decision about that car ownership. And I don't know about the other sort of car owners on the call here, but I've used my car an awful lot less in the last 3 months than the 3 months prior to that. So I might make a different decision about that asset now than perhaps I would have done 3 months ago. So it's quite an extreme example of a changing external factor.
As I mentioned before, the organisational strategic plan feeds your asset strategy, and all those things that John just mentioned and I mentioned before are not necessarily direct inputs, but are key inputs into what service ultimately your assets need to provide. So we'll take a look at this strategy and planning box now. As you can see with the strategy and planning box, there are a number of inputs and outputs to it. The important process here is the merging of top-down direction with bottom-up information to drive a sound asset strategy and ultimately deliver a good asset plan. As I said, and then that plan drives your good asset life cycle. The top-down direction, kind of pointed to by the arrow from the organisational strategic direction, just discussed. It's how that arrow there is how you translate your broad organisational objectives into what you want your assets specifically to deliver. And then obviously the bottom up comes from your asset management decision making, which we'll discuss a bit later. The output, the output of the strategy and planning process is a good asset plan, which ultimately delivers that life cycle. Looking a bit further into what we mean by strategy and planning. Strategy and planning comprises a number of elements, perhaps unsurprisingly strategies and plans, but also asset policy. This strategy and planning element provides the line of sight between top level direction and the person on the ground with the spanner. So that arrow that's in the middle of that page that's going through is the key to good asset management. So looking at that line of sight, starting at the top this time, I'll be a bit more logical. Your asset management policy obviously describes the principles by which you operate in your organisation and you apply asset management. Asset management policy is a series of short, succinct statements of kind of bounds and principles, as I said, by which you want to operate. The document itself is short because it is to be read by everyone in the organisation and should, as I've written there, be signed off by top level management. It is a kind of shining guiding light about what we want to achieve, how we want to achieve what we do with our assets. Moving down, strategic planning. That's the process by which your organisation develops its strategic asset management plan. You might hear the term SAMP if you've been in the game a bit longer. A strategic asset management plan, which ultimately sets out kind of in big handfuls. That's right language. Big strategic handfuls. What the demand is, what our strategic options are to achieve that demand, and then out of those options, what our preferred solution is, and importantly, why. So I said before, a lot of this, in terms of benefits, comes back to evidencing why you've made the decisions you've had. I know, I said at the beginning, a lot of industries are regulated that are asset intensive, but also a lot have very robust shareholders that are very interested in why we're making the decisions we are, and if we can prove that we had a consideration for a number of options and why we picked the option we did is the best one, as I said before, in terms of benefits, that kind of allays most people's fears. And as the name suggests, in strategic planning, it is strategic, so it is a long-term horizon document, as the SAMP is. And then the last piece on there is asset management planning. So that's the kind of the transition and translation of those big strategic solutions that we picked in our SAMP, kind of into a deliverable plan of work. So what most people would recognise as an actual, as a delivery plan. It's those strategic solutions becoming specific kind of asset management tasks, I guess. And since it's a plan, in terms of all best practice plans, they are resourced and have times associated with them for delivery. So that golden thread, is literally golden in this this diagram, shows that is how we in best practice align what our management are telling us to do with what we are doing on the ground in terms of the life cycle.
So what could that look like for our transport and our car example? So this might seem a little bit sort of, well, we don't write an asset management policy for owning a bicycle, do we? But let's have a sort of think about what that could look like. So thinking about translating the organisational objectives into some policy statements. We had a go here that, well, we think travel must be safe as a sort of overriding principle. Maybe we want to minimise and reduce our carbon footprint. We want it to be optimal and economical. So the choices we make around our assets want to make sort of sound financial sense. We want travel to be comfortable. We want to develop and support our people. Now, this is perhaps a bit of a head scratcher when we're talking about a car, but in the wider asset management context, then this is really important. Maybe there's only sort of one person that's confident to or has the driving license at the moment, and we want to support everybody else to get the driving license. Always looking to continuously improve sort of the decisions we make around our assets, so that as Jen said, asset management isn't a sort of get the ISO, put your feet up and have a glass of wine. It's you're constantly looking to continuously improve. So moving that through into strategic planning, I just want to talk a little bit about demand analysis. So when we're thinking about what do we need to do in the context of asset management, we need to understand what the demands are on the services that we provide. So in the context of a car, well, how many journeys do we need to undertake? How often are we going to be traveling? Where are we going to be traveling to? What sort of distance are we going to cover? How many people might be in the car? How many people need to travel? Is it sort of just you, or have you got perhaps an extended family? What about luggage requirements? Cost might come into this as well. And so that then translates down to some asset management objectives. So thinking about our car, our transport example, an objective might be, well, we need a way of commuting to work. We also need a way of taking the kids to school. A hobby might be mountain biking, so we want to make sure we can chuck the bikes in the back at the weekend and drive to a good spot. And overall, we think, well, we'll probably cover about 15,000 miles a year, although probably not at the moment. So now we've got some asset management objectives of what we need our assets to help us deliver. Thinking that through into, well, what are we actually going to do about it? So the asset management planning phase, this is where you really start to develop a plan that resembles something more like a plan that we're familiar with. So, well, we should probably procure transport of some description, whether that's a car or a season ticket for the train or whatever it might be. And we should probably make that time bound, otherwise it's just a bit open-ended. Yeah, we'll buy a car in the next decade at some point. Doesn't really seem too feasible. Financial constraints are important here. Resource constraints. So what resources do we need, both from a financial point of view or a resource point of view, or indeed any other, to achieve those objectives, and making sure that they're feasible and available. And another thing we're going to do is provide relevant training for the operators of our transport. Now, I'm not suggesting we're going to buy a train and train someone to drive it, but we might make sure that the transport that we're procuring is in line with our policy and is safe. If we're buying our own transport, then maybe we're going to make sure everyone that's driving it has got a driving license. Or if we're buying a bicycle, we might take our cycling proficiency test and encourage others to do the same. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense of translating organisation objectives into asset management policy through the strategic planning to set some asset management objectives, and then turning that into an asset management plan.
Now on to decision making. So when we consider the strategy and planning box, we mentioned the need for options and then eventually solutions. But the tricky bit is, how do you decide what to do from those series of options? Asset management decision making, this box is all about putting in place a really consistent, repeatable approach to making those decisions. You know, those decisions ultimately require you to balance off cost, performance, and risk. As I keep saying, cost, performance, and risk, cost, performance, and risk is the key. The balancing of that is the key to good asset management. I guess in terms of decision making, many of you might have heard of decision making tools that are out there. You know, they really usually kind of snazzy computer software solutions, and a lot of them are really good. But I would really, you know, especially if some organisations here are quite immature in their asset management approach and journey, I'd really warn against jumping to straight buying one of those for your organisation. I'm really hoping there aren't too many software providers on the phone, but I'd really warn against jumping, as I said, straight into one of those. They're really good, really good, and really useful for mature organisations. But in the first instance, you know, we all know you can make a good decision based on a whiteboard with some post-it notes and a couple of people with some white towels over their heads in a room. So until, you know, your organisation is sufficiently mature in capability and you've got really good asset management information to support it, decision-making tools can be, you know, unnecessary business investments for you. I guess my final point would also be that, you know, decision making is ultimately a human activity. I love computers as much as the next person, but, you know, at the end of the day, humans often can override any decisions that, you know, a tool will make for you. So I'm sure you'll appreciate that, you know, the board may overrule anything that a computer spits at you. So with that in mind, you know, quality of your people, we'll talk about people a bit later, is just, if not more important than the software that you hold. So as I mentioned, decision making all about the balance of cost, performance and risk against each other to make an informed and evidence decision. What this very simple triangle tries to represent is that the dot in the middle currently represents value to you as an individual, and where you put that dot as an individual represents what value means to you. You know, you can move it around, but ultimately it will have an implication on either cost, performance and risk. So, you know, for example, if I increase my performance, it may likely reduce my risk but increase my cost. Having all three in the middle is an unlikely situation, you know, but to effectively bounce them off against each other, you know, and you know, a lot of mathematicians I'm sure out there, you know, we all need to, you know, have a consistent understanding of what cost, performance and risk are so that we can do that trade-off. So I'll look at each of the three corners in a minute now. So performance covers both asset and service performance. As John said earlier, you know, there's no point in having an asset if it doesn't deliver a service. It's kind of redundant. But there are various ways of measuring performance of an asset, and it depends what your asset is. But examples of performance that can be measured, you know, include safety performance, so lost time due to accidents. You can measure compliance failures. You can measure the percentage an asset is utilised. But it's important to measure the asset across the life cycle of the asset. Because, as I think we'll talk about more later, it's really important to understand deterioration of performance, and therefore when potential interventions are required. But obviously, interventions are you know, need to be balanced across your risk appetite, because, you know, you may have a deterioration in performance, but if you've got a high, you know, low risk threshold, then you'll be fine with letting it carry on deteriorating. So as I said, these three things should never be considered in isolation. So moving on to cost. Cost as an element, again, need to consider it across the life cycle, so across all stages of life cycle delivery, so acquire, operate, maintain and dispose. It is imperative that, you know, you give consideration when talking about costs and initial and future costs. a lot of us will know that a lot of the costs of an asset are in future and they're slightly hidden. You know, many industries will talk about CapEx, so capital costs, upfront costs, and operational costs, so OpEx, or cost for operating, maintaining and disposing. And we need to consider all of it when trading off with performance and risk. So, you know, you've got the cost of not only, you know, so the cost of not only buying or leasing or whatever, but you also, you know, need to get to the end of the asset life cycle and still take into consideration the cost of disposal, and only then can you really trade off against performance and risk. The final element of the triangle is risk. You know, it's a significant part of asset management decision making. A significant part of it is to do with the timing. You know, when do you undertake specific interventions? You know, when do you do maintenance? When do you replace or dispose of it? When do you have that? When do you put in that OpEx spend? You know, when is it best to build more? You know, when do you invest in capital? You know, the best organisations look at their risk profile to tell them that. So I said earlier, kind of modelling of the degradation of assets over time. So, you know, considering the decrease in asset performance and the increase in operational costs and the increase in risk is a really critical activity with asset management. As I said earlier, I'll play bad cop and keep on with the theory. You know, most of us will know that this is the standard.
There's a long
theoretical
section.
Sorry?
I said this is a long section for you.
This is a long section. Sorry, the theory continues. We'll get to the jobs interesting bit in a minute. So most of us know that, you know, this is a standard theoretical way of calculating risk, but it's quite academic and in reality much harder to calculate. If you look at this in a bit more detail, you know, with the asset management lens on, it gives rise to so many questions. The study of risk in terms of asset management in an organisation is a huge one and should not be underestimated. We'll only go into it in a brief amount of detail in a second, but as I said, this makes rise for a number of questions. So, you know, looking at risk in general, how do we work out our appetite for risk as a business? You know, will this change over time? And, you know, how does this link with the external factors in our organisational strategic plan? How do we, you know, are we considering risk of the asset failing, or do we consider, you know, a risk to the asset failing to deliver a service? You know, do we even care if the asset fails full stop? Is it critical to business? You know, if you look at component parts of that equation, the probability and the consequence. Probability, you know, trying to work out the probability of an asset failing, I guess, you know, there are kind of pseudo measures for it. You can look at, you know, how's your asset condition? You know, if your asset's in a poor condition, you can probably say it's more likely to fail. You know, similarly, you know, if you've got a high fault rate on an asset, again, you can probably say that it's more likely to fail. And then when you consider consequence, you know, talking in consequence in asset terms, what is the most critical assets and to your business? You know, asset management talks a lot about criticality, and that's what we mean is, you know, what is the consequence of something failing? Is it actually important to our business, and what happens if it does fail? As I said, I point out this, you know, risk is a really complicated subject, especially in terms of asset management, and I'm not going to go into any more detail here, but it is, again, the final point in that triangle, and one to clearly understand in terms of your business to be able to trade off cost, risk, and performance.
Thanks, Jen. That was a long section. Have a break. So after all that theory, here's my complicated slide explaining what decision making could look like in terms of the car transport example.
You can do it in post-it notes on a whiteboard.
You can, yeah. Just to digress, this whiteboard behind me is an asset management style decision making workshop that I ran with my wife to decide whether we should buy a new bed for the master bedroom or the spare room.
Really is a true nerd.
Yeah, I am a bit of a nerd anyway. Back to what we're here for. So thinking about this car example, we've got a number of options actually, transport options that might sort of fulfill our asset management needs. And we've evaluated those options using a very simple red, amber, green system. More complicated systems are available. And we've just had a look at cost, risk and performance. So evaluating each one. We've said a car, well, that's pretty expensive, but it's really good on risk and performance. Looking at the train, well, you know, perhaps they're not the most reliable ways to transport, to travel, and they're also quite expensive. And so on. You know, walking, well, that was extremely cheap and, you know, kind of fairly risk-free walking, but wow, performance isn't too great if we've got to travel I do a 50-mile round trip for work, and we can't really get mountain bikes in the back of a walk, but maybe we could just ride our bikes instead. But overall, maybe cost is less important to us than performance. So perhaps we're gonna plump for a car, and it kind of helps with the rest of the example. So maybe that's important as well. Having a look at what this might mean in a slightly more complex model, this diagram is lifted from the asset management anatomy, which Jen mentioned earlier. So what could this cost, performance and risk sort of status look like throughout this asset ownership of owning the car? So big cost up front of either buying the car or renewing the car. Probably some pretty standard costs of operating it. Maybe the costs go up a little bit as things start to go wrong with it and it requires more and more maintenance, and then you have to do the cam belt or something, or change the head gasket mid-life. Then it runs all right for a while, and things start to get more expensive and loads of stuff's going wrong with it, and you get to a point where you're thinking, wow, well, the amount I'm spending on this, I may as well just buy a new one. In terms of performance, maybe performance is pretty good to start with. Maybe MPG drops off a little bit after a while. We do the kind of big maintenance on it, and then it improves, and then it continues to sort of drop off, and risk continues to sort of go up. The chance of it breaking down or not starting sort of continues to increase. And we've got decisions to make all the way along here. When's the right point to intervene, to undertake maintenance? Do we do proactive or reactive maintenance along this? When's the right point to go, what, I'm going to cut my losses and just get a new one? Or maybe I don't need a car anymore because I'm never going to be able to leave my house again, or whatever the situation might be. So when you think about the cost risk performance balance, and what that means for different assets and different services, we can start to get into some quite complex models. But they only need to be as complex as the decisions you're trying to make. That brings us to asset information. Jen.
So, we all know to feed good decision making, you need information, and specifically you need information on those three things, on cost, performance and risk, to enable us to do that trading off. So it's really important to have good, reliable, consistent asset information to underpin those decisions. I mean, we all know the phrase of rubbish in, rubbish out, right? So firstly, this is a favourite slide of mine. More data is not the answer to good asset management. More insight leading to better decision making is the answer to good asset management. So, what's really important is having the right insight. We should never go chasing all the data with the hope of one day using it. As an asset intensive business in tough economic times, we all know that it's important to spend time and resource wisely. So on that theme, up here we have this value approach to ensure we're targeting our efforts and resources in the right manner. So it's a consistent logical method to data collection to drive the right activities and the right actions. So I'll explain this a bit more. So if you start from the top, before we even think about what data to collect, that isn't where we should start. We should start with thinking, what outcome for the business is required. Perhaps if you're a regulated business, this is a regulatory outcome that you have to, almost contractually commit to. And once you've got that outcome, you know what you're trying to achieve, you can start to identify a specific action that you should take in order to achieve it. Often those on the ground, those who have got the shovels in the ground, the spanners in the hand, will have a really good intuition as to what action that might be, but have got no means to investigate, kind of academically why further. The following actions then prove or disprove the theory, but having the theory in the first place lets us really be more targeted in what steps we need to take. So from having this action we've identified, we can then identify the insight we require. And once you have the insight that you need, obviously you can work out what analytics you require to drive that insight. And then to support that analytics, you can work out what tools you need. And then finally, you work out what data you need to feed those tools to feed that analytics, to drive that insight, you know, to get that specific action and ultimately the business outcome that you require. I guess so. Yeah, the thrust of that slide is, do not start gathering all the data that exists for every single asset. As a colleague of mine who often says, perfect is the enemy of good enough. So there's absolutely often no need to going to collect 100% of the data to 100% accuracy. You will waste a lot of time and resource in doing so. I think my final point on this slide is that there is real need for standardized data in asset management. You know, being able to input and compare data means it all needs to be in a standard format, and without that, again, you go wasting time, resource and effort of the organization.
I can't echo that point strongly enough, Jen, around, you know, you only need the data that informs your decision that you're trying to make. So do you need it down to pence if you're trying to make £1 million decisions, for example?
Yeah, absolutely, a bit of pragmatism.
Yeah. So thinking about what this means in terms of the car, so there are a couple of or sort of 3 key elements of asset information that I want to talk about. The first is in terms of sort of asset information strategy, and this is sort of lifted from the asset management anatomy. Another plug for that. It's great. It really is good doc. But thinking about what decisions the asset information will help you to make, and therefore what should we capture. So in terms of the car example, maybe we want to make sure that our journeys are continuing to be economical. Kind of links back to one of our the points on our asset management policy. Was it our objective? So we might want to measure the miles per gallon. And interestingly, I think it was one of the first times we ran this workshop several years ago. There was a guy who stayed behind afterwards who showed us a spreadsheet of every time he'd sort of filled up his car, how many miles per gallon he got out of it, the cost of the tank.
John's lying, that's actually him.
It's genuine, it's not. I might have done this, but it's not me. I will start though. Another thing, we might want to make sure that that our journeys are safe, as we said earlier. So we're going to check the condition of the tyres, the brakes, oil before each journey or on a regular basis. Operating costs, something that might be important to us. So we might keep an eye on the cost of fuel, see what that's doing. Asset information standards. Now, this is something that kind of you know, it can easily be glossed over, but it's so important. So, you know, the format of the data. Are we talking about miles or kilometers, or, you know, maybe someone's put it in inches or furlongs or something? You know, just making sure we've got a standard unit for measuring data, or standardized categories of asset data. And at Anglian, years and years ago, we did a big piece of work on asset information, and we buy pumps from a manufacturer called Flight, and we had a look in our asset data systems, and there were 17 different spellings of Flight. So if we wanted to look at all the pumps that we had from that organization, we were never going to find them all. So just putting a drop down box in of it's Flight, standard asset information, makes it much easier to achieve the insight that we needed from it. How often will we capture it? Again, also important. Well, I've checked my tyre condition once every 2 years. Maybe we need to do it a little bit more frequently than that if we want to make sure that the vehicle is safe, unless maybe we only use the car once every 2 years. Asset information systems. So this is where you store your asset information. Thinking about that in the context of a car, maybe we've got some asset information in our service book, like when it was serviced and what pressure we should set the tyres. Maybe we've got an onboard computer which is capturing all sorts of useful analytics and information, maybe even some useless information as well. Do you have an Excel spreadsheet like the chap that I mentioned earlier, or is some of it kind of squirreled away in receipts and that sort of thing, and then maybe when you come to sell the car you want some asset information, you've got a stack of sort of stuff stuffed in the glove box and that sort of stuff. But you know what, that might be appropriate. It depends what you want to use that asset information for. And ultimately, if we sort of get all of this right, that can feed some really good asset management decision making, as we've already explored.
As I mentioned before, ultimately people make the decisions. We might have the latest decision-making tools, but 99% of the time a human will make the final decision. A board member, as I said earlier, can always override the computer. Therefore, it's really important to have qualified, trained individuals empowered in a suitably structured organisation to facilitate the necessary decisions and actions. So the next section we'll just briefly dip into it.
You've done this one, haven't you?
Have. So there are a number of strands that make up a good asset management organisation, and as I said earlier, there's always something to work on. I don't know any organisation that is perfect at all of these things. So starting off with culture, culture is often the hardest thing to get right. Asset management culture is that ingrained feeling within all the staff that they understand their role in the bigger picture. As I said earlier, the conceptual model really shows the breadth of asset management across an organisation, so it is more than just the life cycle. So it's everyone involved understands what they're trying to achieve. It plays back to that that famous story that the cleaner in NASA cites that they put a man on the moon. They had the input into it. Now, culture is driven by leadership, which I'll cover in a minute, but culture to ensure a consistent approach to asset management. Lots of people across an organisation have great ideas, but leadership needs to harness this to ensure that the entire organisation is sailing in the right direction, right in the same direction, so you've not got people going off in all different directions with different ideas. The next one, it lights up, organisational structure. Best practice asset-intensive organisations have asset management strategy that not only describes the strategy within relation to specific asset classes, so technical stuff, but also describes the strategy in relation to asset management capability to deliver those specific asset strategies. The organisation structure should complement the asset management strategy that describes the capability. A well-functioning asset management system has clear roles and responsibilities to ensure that individuals and teams empowered to share information, work collaboratively, and ultimately make the right decisions. As I said right back at the beginning, the key to all this is the coordinated activity, and collaborative working needs to happen across the whole organisation to ensure asset management works properly as a concept, and an approach. The full, as I keep saying, the full conceptual model shows that there are numerous functions across the business that need to be involved in asset management, and it isn't necessarily just the people on the ground with the spanners and the people with the spreadsheets. So competence, obviously competence is important. Well done for getting on this webinar. That's one step. But to complement the organisation structure, we need to make sure that individuals in roles are suitably qualified to make the decisions and undertake the actions expected of them. Training like this today's webinar, and stuff like the IAM certificate and diploma are all really good ways of upskilling individuals, teams on broader asset management subjects. But there'll always be specific jobs and tasks that need certain individuals to have specific technical training. So I think similarly to the ISO, like the IAM training is really good, and it does get you a really good fundamental understanding of asset management and how it should be implemented. But that said, like anything, normally there's real value in on-the-job learning from peers and mentors. And I guess the only little sales pitch I'll do in the whole of this is not even for me, it's for NxtGen. So we'll introduce at the beginning. NxtGen is the kind of part of the IAM, the chapter of the IAM, I guess maybe, that deals with individuals, teams, companies in kind of the infancy of their career, and NxtGen can really help in kind of getting those teams and individuals aligned with their kind of more experienced people. So definitely reach out if that's something you want to get involved in. Leadership, as mentioned earlier, leadership is super critical to ensure strategies are understood by all. We all know you get the top level emails from the boss's boss saying what the latest policy is or whatever, and it's really important that they are on board and driving the right direction. Leadership also often provides the bridge between that translation of the box on the top that talks about organisational strategic objectives. Leadership often provides the translation between those objectives and your asset strategy. They'll kind of help translate them for you and what they're really looking for. Good leadership will also help drive other elements of this slide. So, good leadership drives good culture. Good leadership drives the right structure. Good leadership, promotes competence and all that kind of stuff. And I guess the only other thing is to say that good leadership obviously also can help deconflict any priorities that you have, as they will ultimately make the end decision. And the last point in people and org I'd like to make, it's really important to also look outside of your own organisation to ensure that there's a really consistent whole life approach. So much of what an asset intensive organisation does is dependent on the supply chain. Engaging the supply chain is a real key enabler for asset management. For instance, suppliers often hold key data. Suppliers often understand on the ground asset performance, perhaps more than some people in the organisation. With that in mind, there's a real need for consideration of asset management during the procurement process of suppliers, and also real due consideration should really be given when with asset management being kind of written into supply chain contracts. To drive the right behaviour. There's no point in just going on an asset management journey internally in your organisation if your supply chain aren't brought into it. So I guess that kind of sums up. It's a plethora of activities. As I said at the beginning, there's a lot of work to be done to be a really good asset management organisation, but there's definitely steps along the way you can take to get there.
It's interesting when you sort of dip into it. It's much broader than perhaps first meets the eye, especially when you start to bring in, your external suppliers and contractors and maybe even their suppliers. Thinking about what that means for the car example, I enjoyed that little transition.
That was terrible. The best of the part.
So thinking about, what do we mean by culture when we talk about driving? Could this be how we drive? Do we take safety seriously? There's people out there that drive very differently from other people. There's very sort of cautious, conservative drivers, and then there's those drivers we will like to sort of berate that maybe cut us up or take a risk. So what's the culture around how we drive? Jen mentioned sort of collaboration. Are we thinking about this? Maybe we're a household that owns some cars. Do we all share a car? Do we all sort of talk about how we drive, or do we all own our own cars and do something differently? Organizational structure. This was a little bit difficult to think about this for car ownership, but who's the registered owner? Does anyone else drive it? What are the responsibilities around that? Is it someone's job to, fill it up with petrol? Is it someone's job to clean the car? So what are the clear sort of responsibilities and accountabilities around that? Competence. This one was a little bit more straightforward. So a driving license might be quite useful. What about advanced driver training? Maybe that's something that we'd be interested in, or maybe even like some basic mechanics, if you want to start to undertake some of that maintenance activity rather than outsourcing it. Leadership. So again, leading by example. How do we drive the car? Are we going to encourage the other users of the car to sort of follow the asset management sort of principles that we've set out? If we've got other car users in the household, would we encourage them to keep, useful their service records, that sort of thing? And supply chain. This was quite an interesting one when I started thinking about this. That there's actually a huge amount of supply chain involved in car ownership. Where are you buying it from? Do you go to the same garage each time? Do they have a bit of a knowledge of your vehicle because they've seen it several times before? Do you have a supplier of kind of key parts that maybe when you need new tires, you're like, I need them within 24 hours, or do you have a supplier that can do that? Do you have a favorite petrol station? Maybe you like to go to Tesco because you get your club card points, or maybe you like to go to the one down the road because they sell your favorite snack in there. What about the convenient petrol station? Maybe they've always sold out of diesel. What's your backup petrol station? And I'm sure we could think of a lot more of the supply chain that's sort of involved just in something as simple as car ownership. So final section.
This is the last time I'll play backup and you'll hear me just talk about theory. This is the only slide that you'll be glad. So I think it's right back at the beginning. Sadly, there is no end to asset management. You don't ever complete it, even if you get the ISO certification. So there is a need to continually look and take a hard look at yourself and your external influences to check that you are still operating in the most effective manner. Are you delivering your objectives? Have your objectives changed? There is a need to continually monitor that. In particular, your organisational objectives, and in particular your outside influences are often, in flux. As I said at the beginning, this is very relevant at the moment with COVID. So there's definitely a need, to continually monitor and assess their impact on the business. And obviously, if your if your broader business objectives change, obviously your asset strategies may also change as a result. If you're trying to change your service, as the current climate is a perfect example. And I guess my final point here is the need for contingency planning. So, whilst we might have a great strategy, which is informed by both bottom-up and top-down insight, and we have great people, and the life cycle is working effectively, there are always things in the world that will throw us off course that we cannot plan for. And that, that highlights to us obviously the need for contingency planning. To ensure that if that happens, we've got a plan, and we can still operate to deliver a service.
That's
and
the key point.
All the theory for today.
Fantastic, thank you, Jen. Key point there about contingency is still delivering the service. It's not necessarily still having the asset. It might well be. Thinking about what that means for the car example. So there's lots of stuff here in the review space, but through the things on the left are things that we would perhaps continue to do as sort of business as usual activities. So continued stakeholder engagement, understanding, sort of what our customers' needs are, or if they're sort of changing, regulatory stuff. Management review. So how's the internal performance going of the business? Are we delivering to our asset management plan that we originally set out? Are our assets performing in the way that we would want them to and that we'd expect them to, or maybe we need to make some changes there. Stakeholder engagement is so important that it appears on this slide twice. So thinking about all of those factors and what that means to this sort of changing internal and external environment, think of what that might mean for the car. There might be no requirement to travel unless you're Dominic Cummings, and then there might be. Just going to laugh at myself at that joke. So very much now this stay at home campaign, that might have changed. It might change our asset management decisions. Changing fuel prices. If fuel prices sort of, tripled, would we still want to own that car, or would we look at, something different? Maybe rail prices are halved. New technologies, so electric cars, they're becoming much more prevalent, much cheaper to use. Maybe we would make a different sort of choice about whether we'd stick with petrol or whether we'd move to electric. Maybe our risk appetite changes, so maybe we're used to driving a sort of sports car, and then we have a family and think, well, maybe I'll get something that's a bit safer and a bit more sort of sensible in inverted commas. Interest rates could change. Maybe that changes, if you're on you've got a loan to pay for the car or whatever, or customer needs might change. So maybe we've got a nice family car with 2 kids, and then unexpectedly some twins come along, and suddenly we need a people carrier or something. So the customer's needs might change. Jen talked about contingency planning, thinking about that in the context of the car. What happens if it gets nicked? Car insurance, maybe that provides us with a courtesy car or that sort of thing. What about breakdown cover? What level of breakdown cover do we want? And again, that depends on our risk appetite and the consequence of that. Have we got alternate transport in place? Do we know the number of a friendly taxi company that can help, or do we know the bus timetable so we can still get to work if the car doesn't start in the morning? And maybe the service is actually being able to work, and the car contributes to that service, and actually we can just work from home like we're finding now. So then maybe that calls into question the need for the vehicle. So there's lots of stuff to consider in this review piece, and constantly keeping an eye on the internal and external environment. So using the sort of tools on the left here to keep an eye on what's going on here, and to also have our mind in this contingency planning place. So when the unexpected inevitably does happen, we've got a plan that we can enact that continues us to be able to provide the service that we're expecting. And asset management is never finished, but this webinar is. So I'm going to hand back to
Tom
Will
couldn't help
now.
himself with that.
I like that one. So, yeah, going to hand back to Will.
Thank you so much, Jen and John. That was fabulous, fabulous presentation. You might have seen the chat, but there's been some very good feedback in the chat from people that have had to leave soon. So no, thank you so much. We have a ton of questions, some challenging ones, some easy ones. I'll do some quick fire ones to start with, and then we'll dive into some more detail. I'm just conscious that we've been going for 1 hour and 20, and what I'm going to suggest is we just take a very short 5-minute break, allow John and Jen to sort of maybe catch their breath before we ask them some questions. So we'll resume in 5 minutes. I think that makes it just before 25 past with a series of questions for the last half an hour, 35 minutes, if that's okay with everyone. Oh, we've got you back, John. Do we have Jen back?
I am back. Hello.
Appears as if like magic. Brilliant. So we have had lots of questions, as expected. They came flying in, especially towards the end. I think we peaked at 113 people listening at one time, and it was over 100 for the whole presentation. And a lot have stayed for the Q&A, which is brilliant. Thank you. So we have lots. We have half an hour. We'll try and get through as many as we can, and we'll start with some simple ones. So there were a number of questions around the availability of the slides after this webinar, and also the recording. So we have recorded this. I believe we're still recording, John, the Q&A as well.
Yep.
That will hopefully be made available on the IAM website after this for you to watch back. A number of people have left early but have asked questions, so they're going to watch back to get their questions answered. As for the slides, I don't think we're able to share the slides themselves in the format other than on the webinar, just because that has some material, some IP within it that we can't release too widely. So you'll have the webinar and the slides will be part of that, is the answer to that question.
I think what I would encourage people to do, if there's bits in the slides that, that they're particularly interested in, I keep plugging this, but do download the asset management anatomy, and it goes into more detail than we covered in the slides anyway. And you can always drop Jen or I an email.
Yeah, very fair point. The other thing, there was a question asked around NxtGen and just a bit more background. So for some context, I think the question was around how many people, what are you doing next? We do have a slide on this, I believe. So at the last sort of roll call, we had about 400 members. I think that's stayed relatively steady over the last 2 years. It hasn't grown too much for a number of reasons, but we're at about 400 members. There are I guess we would call them chapters of NxtGen in other territories. So I believe there's a Netherlands chapter, there is a North American chapter, there are a couple of others. I think an Irish chapter is forming. Have I missed any, John?
Gosh, it's been a while. I've been out of the game.
Chapter?
Yeah, Germany, Netherlands. I think Benelux are doing their own thing. Ireland chapter does exist. I think there was talk of Malaysia and the sort of Middle East as well.
I would also stress that it's not it's not an age-related thing at all. And that's the perception of some people. It is a career stage thing. So it's meant to be those relatively new to asset management, rather than an age thing. Absolutely,
yeah, absolutely. And you can see on the screen now there's a couple of interesting statements there. But if you are a member of the IAM, NxtGen is free to access. But we do also run events like these where we try and open it out to sort of anyone involved in asset management that might not be a member of the IAM, just to raise awareness of the discipline, show that there are routes in through the likes of NxtGen to understand the discipline a bit more. So we do run events open to all, but then if you wanted to be a sort of core member of NxtGen, it is if you are a paying member of the IAM. We run lots of different types of events. So Talks from the Top has been a popular one in the past. On-site insights, we call them, but site visits, again, we've run lots of those. I think we did one most recently to Manchester Airport, wasn't it, John, I think, which went down very well. So that was a behind-the-scenes tour of Manchester Airport. And that kind of, lots of other events. So we have stream at the conference every year, or both conferences every year, where we have lots of different events, lots of different themes every time, and types of sessions that we run. But a bit of a look ahead. Obviously, in the current situation, we're trying to do more things remotely. We set out a very, very good and thorough events calendar at the start of the year in January, of which now none of it's happening. We've had to totally adjust. So we are focusing our attention more, obviously, towards these webinars and remote formats. So this was the first. I think there's a demand for another of these in a few months' time, with sort of more people wanting to join. But one thing, a little sort of taster, is we are hoping to run a virtual site tour in the next month or two. So keep your eyes out on that. I won't ruin it or give away the surprise, but that is next on our plan to do. Is there anything else to mention there, John or Jen, on NxtGen?
It's a good way of networking. So if you're an asset owner, it's a good way to chat about similar issues in different organisations. and meet people in, you know, similar space in career. And I've had some, like, I mean, I'm gonna sound biased, I'm super, like, really interesting, like, and I'm not as nerdy as John, like, really really interesting.
Why am I the
like
nerd?
the most memorable one is yeah, NxtGen set up a site visit to go and visit one of the disused tube stations in London. Yeah, that was incredible. That was, yeah, super interesting, excluding asset management. It was just really interesting in general. So yeah, some really, really good people, and also, yeah, good experiences.
Yeah, I'd echo that. You know, I got involved in NxtGen, gosh, probably about 7 or 8 years ago, sort of when it was in its infancy, and it's really opened my eyes of the whole discipline of asset management. I've met loads and loads of different people, been to all sorts of really interesting conferences as a part of NxtGen, and been able to apply that back in my home organization, of bringing that external kind of view of the industry into my home organization. So if what you've seen today is something you think, wow, that seems a bit interesting, I'd really encourage you to check out that link at the bottom of the screen here. Sign up, come along to some more events. I don't know how Will's sort of set for committee members, but I know back in my day we were always looking for people to sort of help out, whether that's hosting events and that sort of thing. So I'm sure there's opportunity to get involved.
Always. If you've got jokes as bad as John's, I'm John Basham. If you've got jokes as bad as John's, you're welcome to join.
No, absolutely. And that actually brings us quite nicely onto the first couple of questions that we had, which was around sort of professional development and route into the discipline. So I've frantically been writing them down and trying to draw parallels between questions to try and form a theme. But we did have one or two around what are the qualifications available in the field of asset management, and which might give you the most value, most bang for your buck, as we talk about in the asset management world. So yeah, I don't know who wants to take that one, but yeah, what qualifications are available and which are the most valuable?
Yeah, I mean, I think I semi started to talk about it in the people and org slide. I think nothing is more valuable, and it sounds cliche, isn't it? But nothing is more valuable than on-the-job learning, especially if your organisation is already quite mature. I can't stress that enough. But you know, if your organisation is generally is not so mature, and you're looking for more formal qualifications, then I would recommend doing some of the IAM certifications. And I know that in the current climate, I think they're now offering them online, the certificates. I think you can get training online from various providers. I won't be biased to any in particular, but yeah, you can get training online. But the IAM offers, I think, it's three levels kind of training. So there's the foundation level training, or fundamentals, I can't remember which one they call it, but that's kind of similar theme, I imagine, to today, but much about, you know, I think it's a half day or a full day that goes into a bit more detail about the anatomy and the conceptual model. Then there is the IAM certificate, which is kind of the next level up. It talks in more detail about the anatomy of the book that John keeps waving. And then the final level up is the diploma, and that is really at the moment the kind of peak of any formal asset management training. I'm aware that there are various master's degrees and bits and pieces out there, but in terms of a whole comprehensive qualification, yeah, that's the best you can get, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that the asset management is a really broad church. So what we're sort of talking about here is the sort of overall general asset management, and the IAM qualifications are great for that. Within asset management, though, that you can imagine there's some very kind of specific specialist roles which come with their own qualifications and so on. What I would encourage you to do is, we talked about the conceptual model and those 6 different parts. If you can get some experience of those different parts of the conceptual model, when you're thinking about maybe career moves or secondments, or even just which projects that you want to work on in your role, see if you can get a bit of experience in each of those areas, and it will help kind of pull the picture together.
Yeah, good job.
Yeah, and interestingly, on that topic of sort of specialisms, asset management being a very broad subject area, and there being very sort of niche activities and capabilities that happen within it, there was one question which was around following the person's been following the Institute of Asset Management for a while and has a background in material degradation and prognosis. How do they get involved in asset management?
So I think that plays more to what John was just saying. So it depends. I mean, if you've got a specific previous qualification in just materials, then I would say that the immediate thing you need to look at is much broader than the technical space. You've got a really niche technical background. I mean, it depends if you want to keep on that technical background, but I'd say even if you do, there's probably a need for you to get that breadth of understanding before you pursue something technical further. Because there is nothing more valuable than understanding how you fit into the bigger picture, if not to understand why people are making the decisions they are. Yeah.
I think it depends very much on the circumstance. I suppose the first thing I would probably encourage you to do is to come to more of these events, join up with NxtGen, and as Jen mentioned earlier on, the network really expands your network, and through that you start to get different insight into the discipline. The other piece of advice that I'd give is, within your organization, if this is possible, to see if you can spend maybe a bit of time with your sort of upstream and downstream customers. So the work that you're working on, where does that go? Can you spend a bit of time with that team, understanding what they do? And it starts to sort of draw that alignment between the different parts of the organization. And if there is an opportunity to move, maybe you've got some experience of a new team that maybe you wouldn't have had initially. But it does very much depend on individual circumstances.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Jen. Okay, so I've linked together 3 questions now, and the theme of these questions were all around starting an asset management journey and what initiatives are going to be most effective. So I think the first question to start that off was, how do you instigate a change or drive a need to improve asset management in an organization that's very traditional, and maybe leadership themselves don't understand asset management and the benefits it can bring? So that's probably the first one to start with.
Yeah, I'm going to draw from experience. Yeah, I think that again, relating back to that people slide, can't highlight it enough, that what you've just said is the leadership is key. They ultimately essentially hold the budget and will drive the organisation's activities and direction on stuff. And I would compel any organisation that is thinking of starting a more professional approach to asset management for their leadership to become educated, whether that's in literally just the basics like this, to understand, to be talking the same language, to know what their issues, to be able to identify what their issues might be, to start targeting. Because as I said, right back at the beginning, this conceptual model is all encompassing, is absolutely everything. If you are a really immature organisation in terms of asset management, you have a lot of options about how you can make yourself better as an organisation. The leadership needs to be suitably educated to understand which parts of their business they want to focus on first, because there is a risk that you try and eat the elephant whole. So I said, yeah, there's a need for your leadership to be educated, for them to make the decision about what part of the business in terms of asset management they focus on to start that journey.
Sorry, Will, go on.
No, I was just going to say that perfectly led into the second question, which was around what are the most effective initiatives to go for first. And I think the answer there, Jen, is it very much depends on the business, probably the industry partially, and I think within lots of organizations, when you do that sort of initial self-assessment or whatever it might be, assessment of your capability, you find there are always going to be areas where you're actually doing a lot better than you think in comparison to others, and areas where you need to improve first. So I mean,
again, I sound like a salesperson, but the IAM self-assessment methodology, which you can get to on I think it's the knowledge section of the website, I don't really remember, but there's a self-assessment methodology which you can either undertake yourself or you can get a third party to do. Is really useful if you want to have if you do a self-assessment, you can have a quick and dirty look at, it will force you to ask questions about all parts of your business, and as I said, it gives you a quick and dirty opinion about which of those kind of areas have, in terms of asset management, a good performance or bad performance, and therefore where you might start to look. I mean, a third party is always generally quite a good thing to do, but it always costs. But a third party opinion, someone external who isn't biased and doesn't have preconceived ideas of what your business is doing, is always a value add.
I think that self-assessment tool is assuming you've got the top level buy-in, the leadership buy-in, which I can't emphasize how important that is. Let's say you've got that buy-in, you want to initiate some change, you know where you want to get to. It's really important that you understand where you're starting from. And I often use the example of, if you're lost in the woods and you want to get, to the pub or whatever, and you've got a map, you need to know where you're starting from, else you're still going to be lost. So that self-assessment tool can really help understand where you're starting from, and then taking a risk-based approach on the areas that are going to give you sort of maximum value. It is a really sensible place to start.
And the third part of that, this sort of theme is
it builds.
it builds very nicely. Once you've identified those, once you've found that you've driven the need for change and you've built that buy-in from leadership, you've understood where your priorities are in terms of maturity and which areas of asset management you need to focus on first. What are the typical durations of an asset management improvement program that we see and work to, and what's appropriate, I guess, would be my addition to that question.
So in terms of an asset management improvement program, so what we're talking about here is building capability within an organization. We're not talking about a plan for the assets themselves. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we're talking about an asset, a capability improvement program, it's going to sound like a complete get out, but again, it completely depends on the stage of maturity of the organisation. So if we're seeing an organisation that is really, really immature, asset management as a concept is brand new. At the moment, for instance, they might just very much sort of focus on the asset life cycle and nothing else. Then a journey to, I don't even know, it depends what your endpoint is, but a journey to, let's say, mature in terms of the IAM's terminology, which I think on the self-assessment is like a level 3 out of 5. That can take years, because it is, and it depends on the scale of the organisation. Because, as I said, if you consider all elements of that conceptual model, if you want to get them all to a good, mature standard, and we're not saying exemplary, we're saying an acceptable, good standard. That is years worth of work, and it's a lot of money. And that's why, I was saying before, that is a reason why you try not to eat the elephant whole, and you work out what to focus on first.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, so moving on to a slightly different theme. One question, John, that came in around data and decision making. How do you handle asset management decision making when you don't trust the underlying data?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, and you often, we hear in our industry that the data is rubbish. The data has never been better. So it comes back to Jen's slide, really, of thinking about what data do you really need to know to make the decision? What sort of level of detail of data do you need? And if you haven't got that, or you don't trust it, what can you do to get the data? What can you do to improve on it? And at the most basic level, sometimes that's in sort of systems, or we can use modeling tools to help us. And other times there's an intuition. And I'm not suggesting that this is appropriate for every asset management decision, but any of you that are sort of familiar with things like the wisdom of crowds, or saying the answers in the room, is sort of using people to generate the data and to get a tacit feel for what's best. So there's lots of different ways that you can try and fill the gaps in with your data. And I suppose one thing to always think about is always use the best data that you've got available. So whatever that might be, it might only be a 3 out of 10 rather than a 10 out of 10, but still use a 3 out of 10. Ask yourself how you can improve it.
Yeah, I'd also say there is a need for, if you're only using 3 out of 10 data and that's the best you've got, then that's kind of fine. But what you need to be really careful of is the comms that go with any decisions that you make based on that data. Because obviously you don't want your top level leadership, making the decision they have to based on that data, thinking it is 100% accurate and fully informed. There's need for kind of caveats, and when you present that data, don't present the data, present the decision, that you also present the caveats and also the improvement plan, because next time it will be better because we will do X, Y, and Z.
And a lot of asset management is about being conscious of that. So you're consciously making a decision, knowing that your data is not great, but you're aware of it. You've assessed the risk. You've deemed that it's acceptable, rather than sort of not being aware of that and doing, as Jen says, making a decision thinking it's 10 out of 10 data quality and it's not. So awareness and consciousness of that is really important.
Yeah, it all goes back to you might have an asset improvement plan, which is part of your asset management capability improvement. and it all ties together. It's a, you know, there is no one organisation I can think of that does this perfectly, and it's the cliche of being on a journey and all that kind of stuff. But it's the bit that ties back to that risk and review box of, okay, we did it this time, sure. How do we do it better next time, and what we're going to improve and what's going to change?
Yeah, and the question did also mention sort of uncertainty and sensitivity analysis. And I guess one way around, one thing you should do if you're using 3 out of 10 data, John, for your analogy, is making sure you're running multiple different scenarios. Maybe you're using a low, medium, and a high scenario. That's sort of one practical thing you can do quite quickly and quite simply. To look at, you know, your range, and when you're communicating it to the leadership, you can say, I think it's this, however it could be plus or minus whatever in the range of output. So I think that developing a good, even a very simple but good understanding of uncertainty is also a valuable thing to do.
Yeah, you're right, exactly. That you know, if you've got uncertainty around your cost data, obviously that implicates the decision based on the performance and risk data. So it's just yeah, it's having that understanding of how it impacts the decision, which part of it.
Absolutely, and just kind of continuing on a data and analytics theme, there was one question around finding the process of calculating whole life cost for a single asset quite simple, but for a complex system, how would you go about doing that?
That's a whole that's a whole other webinar. Yeah, so whole life costing and whole life cost modelling is a art. Science, probably an art in itself. I don't even know where to begin on this of it, but it's yeah, the amalgamation from a single asset to a whole asset base is a full modelling exercise, and isn't straightforward. I would like to say it's easy, it's not. And it requires you know, expertise on both, generally on cost data, but also on the estate and on the assets.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge load of, as Jen says, that's a whole another webinar. The data that goes into that is really important. So cost data that might be from previous capital type investment, but also from previous operating costs, and it's probably quite easy to link it back to a car example. You could actually track that data. In terms of how you do the whole life cost assessment itself, there's lots of different tools out there, ranging from relatively simple things you could do on a flip chart in a workshop to give you an indication, versus very complex IT systems that do loads and loads of computing. However, what I would say is that doing some kind of whole life cost analysis, even if it's a very basic level, is going to give you much more of an insight into not doing any at all. So even if the capability you have is just something basic, then I would encourage you to do that and take some insight from it and see if it helps you to make decisions.
It's a really good question.
It's a very good one.
I don't think we can do it justice. Just give it a 2-minute answer.
Maybe it is another webinar. Maybe it is another webinar.
It's another webinar, or it's a proper conversation with someone one of us, like, specifically on that topic.
Yeah.
More than happy.
Okay, time for a more interesting and topical question. So, considering the impacts of the current pandemic, what is the importance of asset management? And you know, what's a priority focus right now to handle the current situation?
I think where, you know, COVID is a prime example of, you know, one of those external factors I was talking about earlier. So that top grey box, when you talk about forming your organisational strategic plan, is one of those external factors that you didn't know was coming, and will ultimately need, you know, your organisation to review the way it operates. And it also plays into one of the latter points we were making about contingency planning. So it highlights nothing more than the need for, you know, asset-intensive organisations to have contingency plans for scenarios that can't naturally be planned for, to, you know, to maintain the delivery of the service, even if we don't have access to the assets or similar.
There's a couple of things here that resonate. I suppose one way you could look at this question is How can we use asset management as a framework to help us to deal with the impacts of COVID-19 that we're facing as a planet, really? And the second way of looking at it is, how can we use asset management as a framework for my organization to deal with the impacts? I'll just start with the latter. So thinking about sort of typical big asset owning organizations, the demands on infrastructure can vary massively. So we mentioned the road network earlier. There's much less traffic on the roads. If we're able to safely, that might be a really good time to undertake some maintenance activities if we can do so safely, and so on. Impact on the water industry. We put the most water into supply in a single day that we have ever done in our entire history during the pandemic. It was a few weeks back, a hot day. Everybody's at home, using their paddling pools and that sort of thing. So for us, we had to make sure all our assets were able to cope with the demand. Just to pick up the format, how can we use asset management as a framework to help us as a planet, a country, whatever, combat this? Some of the tools that we've talked about in terms of understanding where the risks are, making the best value decisions, of making sure that the activities we undertake give us maximum value to meet our objectives of minimizing the number of deaths as a result, helping to keep the health services at a level that's manageable, and making sure we make interventions at the right time. There's been lots of this stuff in the press, and whether those decisions have been the right ones or they haven't. But a lot of the tools that we've explained today can go into helping us to do that.
Yeah, I guess kind of on the other side of it is that if you take an asset management approach to your decision making, and you have a good contingency plan, if something doesn't deliver, if there is a failure for some reason, and the finger points at you and your organisation, there is a clear evidence trail of why the decisions have been made the way they are, and it's transparent. You can see the line of sight why that decision was made. You can justify it. You're not caught on the back foot trying to think of an excuse.
Yeah, I think that's more, certainly from my experience, that's more important now than ever, that decision-making process, because obviously another impact of COVID on asset-intensive industries is that their capital plans have changed massively. We mentioned supply chain earlier, but the way you set up your supply chain might have meant that it's massively impacted by COVID, and you can no longer deliver what you set out to. All those great decisions that you made, you can no longer go and implement because of the supply chain has been impacted. So that having that really robust process around decision making and allowing you to revisit those decisions and make them again quickly, but still based on evidence and not resorting back to a poorer way of making decisions, I think is another really important thing.
And that's it, linking it back to the data that you use to make that decision.
Yeah.
You can start to see how that conceptual model really starts to come together now.
Yes. So no, good. It was a good question. Thank you, Yusuf. We've probably got time for all of them. There's two more. This was a very interesting one that came in towards the start. It is how can we use an asset management framework and the principles to manage assets where they're on other people's lands?
Mm-hmm.
This is about the stakeholder relations, isn't it? Kind of semi-supply chain, as you were saying before, about assets being on other people's hands. So your organisational objectives will take into consideration, obviously, the fact that there is a third party involved, and that may influence what you want to do. Also, there's the people in all government. It depends what the third party land holder does. If they're literally just the landholder and they don't use the assets, then obviously that's not so much an issue. But it depends if that third party uses what you are managing, as to how you would interact with them in an asset management world.
Yeah, I think what was mentioned was riparian ownership, which is, I think, and national bodies. So I assume it's maybe a council owns an asset that's going through people's properties. And if it's a stream or whatever, I think in some cases you are responsible for for maintaining that asset if it goes through your property. So where my head went with that question was, it's almost across the conceptual model that Jen and John taught you through. You sometimes have split. Not one organisation might own all of that conceptual model. Sometimes responsibility is split, and we see this quite often in the rail industry. You have an asset owner who might own the assets and is responsible for the outcomes, but you have an asset deliverer or an asset manager that deals with the life cycle delivery part. So it's almost this split of responsibility and accountability, I think, across the asset management process. It's not always one organisation that does it all, I think, was where my head led to.
Yeah, no, okay, well that makes more sense now. Yeah, so you know, and the fact that there is this kind of conceptual model, at least as John keeps saying, gives you this framework for having those conversations. Because it lays out on the table, you know, everything you must consider, the fact that it's kind of dual ownership, dual kind of engagement, investment, whatever you want to call it. Yeah,
and clearly defining those interfaces and who does what is very critical. So in the rail example, it's, you know, who owns the safety case? Is it asset owner or is it asset manager? It's some of those fundamental parts of the asset management system are key to get right if there are multiple parties involved, I think.
Yeah, each of those arrows on that conceptual model is a process, a business process, I guess, at its best. And yeah, as you just said, it's key to defining, especially if there are multiple parties of different interests, the handoff points between them.
Yeah. Okay, let's go for the last one, because we've got 5 minutes, and then we'll close. This question was around the importance of KPIs at the start of, I guess this meant an asset management improvement program, but I think it was also more broad in terms of the importance of KPIs generally across the asset management system, and any sort of industry references that use KPIs to sort of measure performance of the physical assets.
Yeah, well, I guess if we're talking about the KPIs associated with the physical assets for a second, and we'll park the capability KPIs. And yeah, so when I was talking about the need to make decisions based on the trade-off of cost, performance, risk, obviously one of those elements being performance, there is a need to be able to quantify things. So on the slide, I think I said there are different ways depending on what your asset base is as to how you measure that, and there are a number of ways of defining asset performance associated with your different asset base. So I said a measure might be utilization, a measure might be percentage compliance, if you're wastewater or something, or your performance measure might be safety, lost time incidents, number of those. There's different ways of measuring performance depending on what industry you are in, because obviously it has to relate to a lot of them relate to specific assets. There are some that are generic across the piece, doesn't matter what the asset are, but there are quite a few that are quite specific. But if you, a good place to look would be a lot of the, if you're really starting out from scratch, there are quite a lot of utilities, rail providers, highways industry that have a lot of business plans, their kind of commitments, business plans and commitments published widely, publicly, online, that you can go in and have a look at, and they will tell you about what they are measuring in terms of asset performance that they have to report on. Mostly it isn't everything that they'll report on, but it'll be the ones that they'll have to report to a regulator, and that should give you a good idea of some asset management KPIs.
Yeah, I think in terms of those sort of high level performance commitments, there are some great well documented examples out there. In terms of the sort of internal performance management, and what do you measure? I always think it's important to get a broad balance of measures. So often it's really easy to measure, the financial numbers, or, how many projects have we delivered. It's also important to measure some of the slightly less tangible things, which might be the, the sentiment around business processes. What's the feel of your customers' reputational? It could even be things about, are we hitting the milestones on our improvement plan? What's the latest feedback from the employee survey? And when you put it all together, you get a more holistic picture of your sort of asset management processes, rather than, we're hitting the financials, but everyone's really unhappy and is going to leave, and we're going to have a real problem. So that balance of measures is important.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. That's all our questions. We got through them all, and just in time as well. No, thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation again. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed listening. I think the questions at the end were great. So thank you to those who asked questions, and for everyone else. I really hope you enjoyed that webinar. We are going to do more, I'm sure. We'd like to do several over the next few months. I would just reiterate that if you do go to the web links on the slide now, you can find the NxtGen page there. There's an email address there that you can use to contact us. So if I did miss your question, I'm sorry. Please send it to that email address and we'll get back to you. And there you can sign up for more webinars. So thank you very much. Is there anything else, Jen and John, before we close?
No, I guess just echoing what you just said. I mean, thanks everyone for coming. I'm glad we didn't just talk to no one or ourselves, because John's jokes are terrible. Yeah, as Will just said, if you want to get in touch, there's our email addresses. If you've got any specific questions that you don't think we've covered enough today, yeah, drop us a line.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming, and some really good questions there as well. So yeah, thank you, and thanks Will for arranging.
No problem. Thanks, Jen and John, again, and thanks everyone. I hope you have a great rest of the week.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.